Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about Marito's cool book on Buddhism, especially his discussion of the nature of the self. So let us begin. So here's a question. Here's the way that Marito puts it. Who do you think you are? Right? I like that in his language. And from a Buddhist perspective, this question matters a lot, right? This question in English has the implication of you're over assessing your importance, right? That when we tell someone, who do you think you are? We're not just inquiring into their notion of their own selves. We're actually implying you're over exaggerating your own importance, your own conception of yourself. It's inflated, it's misguided, it's distorting the way the world is. And of course, Bodhimato knows this. That's why he puts it this way. And he thinks essential, he recognizes essential to the Buddhist picture is the observation that we all are subject to this kind of question/criticism. We tend to overinflate our notion of ourselves. We have this distorted sense of self. And then we interpret reality through that distorted sense of self. And that's what gives rise to a lot of distortions of what's around us. That's one observation. But secondly, crucially from the Buddhist perspective, that distortion is the fundamental source of suffering. In fact, suffering is the misalignment between your expectations, especially conception of yourself, and the way the world is. So that's what we're talking about it. But anyway, so who do you think you are? What is the self? So for Buddhists, everything in the world is composite and relational. Composite is composed of parts. Relational, it's embedded in a network of relation. All of the parts are what they are because they're related to other parts, right? So everything in the world is composite and relational. And here's an observation. You are one of those things in the world. You are composite and relational. You is the self, right? So what are you made out of? What are selves made out of? One picture is a materialist picture that says, well, a self is a body and the body is composed of electron, quarks, bosons, and so on, right? There's this material composition of the body. A traditional Buddhist picture has that a self is a combination of both the body, the physical stuff, and mental stuff. And the mental stuff, I think, things like thoughts, feeling, perceptions, and so on, right? So what is the self? Well, a traditional Buddhist picture is it's this kind of combination of things that are physical, like hands, fingers, eyes, and things like that. And mind, so mental things like thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. The self is a complex arrangement of all of those parts, some physical parts and some mental parts. It's important to note that there is this minority cool view within Buddhism that says, actually, no, it's just minds. What we call bodies, what we call physical things like chairs, there's just perceptions in minds. So there are thoughts, feelings, and so on. And then there are the objects of those thoughts and those feelings. So a chair, a table, a tree, just are the objects of perception. They're just the content of perception. So fundamental reality is just mental. Everything is mental. That's kind of cool. But anyway, so there is some disagreement within the traditional Buddhist picture about what the basic elements of the self amount to. But the claim is that whatever those elements are to, the self is just the composition and relation amongst those elements. So, so the self is a collection of those things, and the self endures through time. So it's not merely that it's a collection of parts, but that it's a collection of parts that are themselves in constant flux. What does that mean? The parts are coming into and out of existence, or at least into and out of the collection of parts that is the self. So think of the body, right? That's part of who you are. And the body is composed of things like cells, and all of those sort of cells are changing. If I remember correctly, it takes roughly 7 years for all of your cells to be replaced. So every 7 years, you have an entirely new collection of cells. I think that's correct. But it's crucial that it's not like you have 7 full years of the same cells without change, and then they disappear and new ones come into existence, right? That's not how it works at all. It takes 7 years for them to be replaced, but they're constantly being replaced. Cells are dying as we speak. Cells are being, generated as we speak. They're, aging. They're changing as we speak. So the process of replaying the parts of your body, namely the cells, is in constant flux. They're coming in and coming out of existence constantly. So you are, in terms of your body anyways, composite, the collection of those parts that are purely relational, the way they relate to each other, and that relational complex is in constant change itself. That's what you are in terms of the body. And then the Buddhist points out, and the same thing happens in the mind element. Think of the mental things like thoughts, feelings, emotions, perceptions, your mental life of your consciousness. It's equally relational, composite, and in constant flux. What you feel now changes later, and so on. So there's this ever kind of changing elements of the constituents of the parts of your mental life, just like the body, right? So yourself, both mental and physical, is just a collection of different parts coming together in different ways. It does what it is, and the different parts coming different ways is constantly changing and evolving and becoming something new. That's what the self is. So let's think about that for a little bit longer. So talking about you claims Morimato on behalf of the Buddhist is like talking about Microsoft, right? Think about Microsoft. We use the word, right, but what does the word refer to? Actually refers to this very complicated, we might begin by saying corporation, but then we say, well, what is a corporation? Well, it's like something like buildings and people and history and interaction between them, and they like make products of different sorts. They have a history of relating to, right? Microsoft is a very complicated way of what we talk about when we talk about Microsoft is this very complicated way in which different parts come together and relate to each other and perform a kind of function, a corporation function. But there really is nothing more than to Microsoft than that complicated arrangement of the parts and the functions they perform. It's not that there are the buildings, the people, the past, the things that they do, and then there's also Microsoft. Like no, Microsoft just is that complicated arrangement. And likewise for a soccer team like Manchester United, it's not that there are the soccer players and the history and the games they play, and then there is something else called Manchester United. No, Manchester United just is the complicated arrangement of the way in which those parts come together, which are in constant flux, right? Like the elements that people work for Microsoft, some come in, some leave, and like there's a constant flux of change and rearrangements of parts, and even the parts themselves. That's how Microsoft works. That's how Manchester United works. And here's the Buddhist kind of great observation. That's how you work too. The you yourself is this complicated kind of causes and effects arrangement of parts, relational arrangements of parts. And it's a neat way, it's an easy way of talking about or picking out a very complicated set of arrangements of parts and things like body cells, thoughts, feelings, and things like that. But there's nothing extra. There is no other thing other than the complicated arrangements of causes and effects, parts, and so on. You are just like Microsoft. That's what you truly are. So let's think about that a little more. What's that mean? Well, it means that your identity, who you are, is essentially relational. Think of the roles you play in the world. You might be a mother, you might be a daughter, you might be a boss, you might be a citizen, you might be a neighbor, right? Those are different ways of describing who you are. But it's crucial that we hear the right thing. You might think that I'm the self-standing, independent being, and that characterizes the intrinsic, unchangeable things that make me what I am. But all of that's false, right? Like to be a mother is essentially to be in relation to someone else, right? You cannot be a mother unless you have a daughter or a son. And likewise, to be a daughter is essentially to be in relation to someone else, namely to your mother, to be a boss, and so on, right? All of these labels are essential ways of illustrating the way in which you're connected in this network that is reality. So yourself is just a way of the identities that constitute the self is just a way of illustrating the different relations that define you, the different ways in which you relate to the totality of the world. And there's nothing specific about these examples. I mean, we begin with the example of mother and daughter because it's obvious how it relates to others. But think of any label that might describe you. Think like being a painter. That one doesn't immediately seem relational like mother does, but it is, right? One cannot say, I'm a painter, but I've never taken any painting classes. I never painted anything. I don't have any talent. Like the kinds, what makes you a painter is this particular history of having dedicated talent to painting. Like there are papers out there that have your work. You went to classes in which you were taught, and there is this being embedded in the world in a particular way, relating to things other than you in a particular way, is what it is to be a painter. If you're not related to those other things other than you, in that way, you're not a painter, right? If you don't paint things, if you don't go to classes, if you don't care about painting, go to museums, people don't look at your art and say, "Wow, that's a good art." If none of that happens, you are not a painter. And likewise for anything that defines you, anything that you think characterizes yourself is just a way of highlighting a way in which you're embedded in this network of relations that is the world. Yourself is relational. So let's try to say that differently. So here's one way of putting it. The world is not just a place where you live or the setting or background for the events of your life. It's not like if you think of a novel, there's the setting up of the background for the main story of the protagonist that is kind of independent from like the background setting. That's not really quite what you are. You grow out of the world and exist in a way that depends upon everything within it. So when someone says something like, "Oh, if I had lived in medieval Europe, I would have done this," or if had been had it been in second century this part of the world, they would have done that. They're not really thinking about who they are and what it means for them to be them and what it would have been for had someone been born in second century Pakistan or something, they it wouldn't be them, right? They might be envisioning getting into a time machine and showing up there with the current kind of like mental states and history and so on, and like something would follow from that. But if they think something like, "Oh, had it been in 16th century Europe, I would have done this," um, they're not really thinking carefully. What they are is someone who was born in a particular way, had a particular history, has a particular kind of a narrative. Their selves grew out of the world, and the world is their particularity, the way in which they came into being. So, a way of saying that is that you are not coupled into the world with fully formed wishes, hopes, beliefs, or traits. Your wishes, hopes, beliefs, or traits result from your environment, the way in which you relate to other things. Or here's a cool way of putting it: you don't exist prior to the relationships that you enter into, and then you enter into them. Rather, you emerge. What it is to be you emerges, comes out of being in that network of relationships that you had, that you find yourself. What you are is the location within the network of relationships that makes the world, and you position within the world. That's what the self is. So, okay, why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about the nature of the self? One, because it's pretty fascinating, but also because from a Buddhist perspective, it's all about solving the problem of suffering. And solving the problem of suffering requires an adequate understanding of the way the world is. And the Buddhist is fond to point out that we tend to distort the world because we don't understand the self as we just described, which is how the self is. Rather, we tend to have a much more self-inflated notion of the self, and that changes the way we look at the world. So, one important mental habit that distorts reality is the tendency to experience the world as in a self-regarding way. You experience the world as somehow about you, by interpreting things to the extent that they affect the self and its projects. You're walking on campus, you see a tree, you think, here is a tree in my pathway and my campus when I go to my class, right? Things around you, you understand not only in relationship to you, but in relationship to your projects. And you notice them, they have meaning and relations to you because of the way in which they play a role in your self notion and your self narrative and in the projects that inform your self narrative. And the Buddhist points out that's not how the world is. Like an existentialist like Sartre will say something like, the tree doesn't care about you and your projects, right? The tree does not see itself as, "Oh, I am that person's tree and that person's role and that person's university." That's not how the tree sees itself. And the point of the idea about the tree is supposed to be like the way the world is, right? Because the tree is not conscious. So the way the world is such that your roles that you project onto it are kind of orthogonal to what it is. Here's a good example that occurs in the book. So a traffic jam, if you find yourself in a traffic jam, can seem bad to you, right? Like, "Oh, that traffic got stuck in a traffic jam." Why does it seem bad? Because your self-image is interpreted in a particular way. Why? Because it's preventing you from getting where you want to be. You have this goal, this project you want to go to meet some friends, and then traffic jam, and you're upset, right? You understand the traffic jam as an obstacle to the fulfillment of your projects. That's what the traffic jam is to you. That's what it means to you. Or perhaps you might understand the traffic jam as good for you if it turns out that it's prolonging the going to some place you don't want to go. For anybody to a party, you don't really want to go there. You want to spend the less time possible with that group of people, and then the traffic jam occurs, and you think like, oh, good, I'm gonna spend half of the party here, so I don't have to do that, right? So your interpretation of the traffic jam as good or bad has to do with the way you relate into the world, with your interpretation of your surroundings via the self regarding image. It is good for you because it aids in your projects. It is bad for you because it prevents you from attaining your goals. And the Buddhist observation is it's actually neither. Like the traffic jam didn't happen because of you, for you. Like you're just misunderstanding what's happening there. You're projecting things into the world. And that matters when it comes to like solving the problem of suffering. Your frustration with the traffic jam because it's preventing you from going where you want to go is largely the creation of your expectations of your self-image. Is you're reading your surrounding as going to this cool place, and then something gets in the way. It is your frustration with your inability to get what you want that is suffering, but that is grounded in your self-image. So in your distorted self-image, your conception of reality as though being about you, instead of you being embedded in the network of relations of reality. So it gets worse, I think, the Buddhist. At the heart of frustration and suffering is not merely that you distort the world through self-image and then you like things look painful because you think they're about you when they're not, but then you get overly attached to things in a distortive way. The conception of yourself makes you overly attached to things. Yourself is embedded in things in a way that it shouldn't be. Like this picture, you're going to overly attach yourself to things in a way that is distortive, because that's not how things are. So it's not just that we want things. I mean, that's an observation of us, and that's what gives rise to suffering. But there's an attitude of attachment that often accompanies or undergirds this desire for things. So what is sometimes called that grasping or clinging, and that's just that you don't just want something, but you kind of are hung up on it. You don't just want to go on a date with this person you find attractive, but you want to like build a permanent relation to this person as they are now because they're so attractive now. But the observation is, well, they can't. Like their selves is just changing. Yourself is just changing. You don't have the thing that you want is the endurance of the thing that you want cannot in principle be had. You get overly attached to your self-image at this particular stage in your life, or your projection onto someone else in what they represent for you at this stage in your life. And if you go on a date with someone and what you are wanting is for them to stay at that stage forever, and you get overly attached to this particular perception of a self. And that's what really hurts you, because as time goes on, regardless of what happens, it's not going to work out, right? Maybe the date doesn't go well, you get upset, or it does go well and you continue the relationship, but the relationship will change. The person will change. So in either case, your attachment to this particular ideal will lead to suffering. It is attachment to an ideal, a permanence of something that cannot, in principle, endure, that causes most suffering, claim the Buddhist. So there are many, many objects of attachment. In fact, the self is constantly seeking to attach itself to things. It seeks to endure as it is, but as time goes on, of course, it can't. Some of those things are things like group membership, things like national identity, political affiliation, schools that you attend, hobbies, and so on. All of these things you relate to the world via the self, right? Think of political affiliation. A great election comes out, a very important election, and your side wins or loses. And you're super excited or super upset. And not so much because you like notice the way in which the political event or the election is going to affect the world. It's not this objective, detached assessment of the way in which reality is shaping up, but rather it's this connection to you. You're very excited because your team won. You're excited because your party won, or you're very upset because your party lost, right? It's this self-attachment, this attachment grounded in this self-notion that is kind of driving. And that's what creates a lot of the suffering. You're overly committed to, you're overly attached to something via the self-image. And that's the source of all trouble for suffering, claims the Buddhist. So this attitude of attachment reorganizes your experiences around the self. It is your nation. It is your party. It is your, project. It is your school that you attended to. It is the hobby that you do, right? It's about you. You see the world through the self. You get overly attached to that identity of the self in those kind of activities connected with the self. And as things change, you are frustrated. Attachment necessarily leads to frustration and suffering because things will change. So attachment is at the heart of suffering. Okay, let's end here. I'll see you next time.